Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bible Thumper Podcast. My name is Patrick Hayes, and with me tonight is Zechariah King.
I'm here, man.
And we are going to be talking about hermeneutics.
Spell it.
Hermeneutics. Hermeneutics.
I hope that's right.
I don't know if it is.
I was always bad at the spelling bee part of things.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of $5 words. So we're going to be defining them as we go because we're going to be speaking Christianese. And we'll try to make the subject we're going to be on and the words and the definitions known and read and explained just to help everyone stay up on what we're talking about. So do you want to, you're the one that picked hermeneutics for tonight.
Well, this is one that I think you and I could have a fun discussion about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just sitting and talking.
Yeah.
It is incredibly important, even though it's a word
absolutely.
that no one can spell.
Yeah.
But if we define it as the framework by which we try to understand what the scriptures are saying, then everyone has one.
Everyone does, even if they don't know
even
that.
If you don't know that you do, you have one. And if you don't have a fairly clearly defined way of understanding what your hermeneutic is, then you could get blown by the wind all over the place.
You can be all over the map. So I defined it as, or I might have cut and pasted this definition, so I don't want to take credit for it.
Sure.
But I was looking it up to try to figure out, the best way to phrase it to make it easily understood. So the art or science of interpretation.
Sure.
Meaning the way that you interpret the Bible. And you will find this word, hermeneutic, we'll stay with that. You will find this word, hermeneutic. They just slipped the notes I wanted printed off under the door. You will find this word, hermeneutic, with literature as well. Forget it. I got it. It's on the laptop.
I was going to see if I could reach it.
No, it's fine. When you're dealing with classical literature, how do you interpret what you are reading? Okay, so there's a method as opposed to, how do I feel about this verse?
Right.
Okay, so in biblical interpretation, there are many types of hermeneutics that have emerged. There are ways that people, when they read the Bible, mostly when they study the Bible, or when they're trying to get answers to portions of the Bible that are a little more difficult, a lot of times the prophets, because let's face it, when we're going over the commandments and it says, thou shalt not steal,
pretty straightforward.
Do we need to interpret that in some way? I think we can just...
The only people who do are the ones who are trying to get away.
Trying to get out of, or from underneath that commandment, the people that want to steal. Okay, so I have a couple different types of interpretation that I think are pretty popular.
Okay, yeah.
But what do you think about?
Well, I mean, the basic one that everybody thinks about, because I think we do a huge disservice to ourselves.
Okay.
And I think we do this in a lot of different ways in our culture, but we build sort of false dichotomies. So the first place that everybody goes to is, do you believe in the Bible literally, or do you believe in it spiritually? And the ones that spiritualizing the scriptures, I'm not even entirely sure what that would mean.
Yeah, I don't like using that term, spiritualizing, although I understand what someone means when they say, the spiritual or the mystic, the way they look at the Bible as to always mean more than what's at face value.
Sure.
And they're always trying to get... So it sounds to me like what you're explaining is that people will call literal and allegorical as mutually exclusive.
Sure.
Like, which one are
Sure.
you?
Yeah. And it's like,
And
oh,
if you're this one, then you're not that one,
sure,
and you have
sure.
nothing to do with
It's
it.
like, oh, Patrick takes the Bible literally. So if you show up to his house unannounced, like
Mhm.
he's a super right wing conservative,
Mhm.
show up to his house unannounced, you might get shot.
Mhm.
Like just, but that's the only. If you believe in things literally, then that's the camp you're in.
Yeah.
And if you're like, well,
Yeah.
I think there might be some metaphors in the Bible, then you go, oh, well, this guy didn't even believe anything.
Sure.
Yeah, you couldn't
Okay.
figure out anything that's going on because it's all just like floating around in the air, lovey-dovey.
Okay, so in the same way, if you are a fundamentalist, then that means that you are against the Holy Spirit and against talking about or believing in the power of the Holy Spirit.
Sure.
And if you are a Pentecostal, then you are a charismaniac
Oh, yeah.
who
Like,
cannot be nailed down on anything because you go entirely off of feeling.
what does it really mean to steal?
Mhm.
And you write a book about like, yeah. And so we build those two in our minds. We just do this naturally somehow or another, but we build these two sort of categories where I look at it, and I know Chuck Missler, who I've done a couple of his studies.
Mhm.
I think he said one time that there's 27 different types of speech, types of writing that are used in the scriptures.
Nope, over 200.
Over 200.
Yeah. So, and we can get into some of those, but
Sure.
in the same way, because I've had people say to me, well, how do you know when God is speaking literally and when he is speaking allegorically? And I say to everybody, have you ever read any other book? How do you know when I'm speaking literally and allegorically?
Sure.
Zach, I have something heavy we got to get out of the truck. Can you lend me a hand?
Right.
Okay, well, do I want your hand, or is that
Sure.
an example of a type of speech that means something greater?
Right.
Okay, man, I saw your new car you drove up in. That's a nice set of wheels.
Yeah.
Well, I don't mean just the wheels.
Sure.
That's indicative of the entire car. Okay.
Right.
When I need your help lifting something heavy, I don't literally mean I want your hand. I want the whole body attached to the hand. Okay. So these are figures of speech, and the Bible is full of them.
Yes.
God used them. The authors of the Bible wrote them down, and there's nothing wrong with understanding that. Okay. So how would you excuse me, how would you define the literal interpretation of the Bible? The guys who would say that my hermeneutic is going to be literal.
What I've heard said most, I think, is that when the plain sense makes sense, seek no other sense.
Mhm.
Right? That's something that you've?
I think the idea of like plain text, we are trying to figure out what the biblical text is saying based on the plain meaning conveyed to the text with basic historical context. Okay, we're not.
If it says that Noah built an ark,
Yeah.
and there were 8 people inside of it,
Yeah.
what it means is Noah built an ark, and
Yeah.
there were 8 people inside of it.
And that's something that I'm gonna get to because I actually am going to go over my personal hermeneutical style.
Mhm.
And I have 6 points that I want to go over as far as I think these are all good ideas when you're studying the Bible. And I don't know if I'd necessarily keep them in the order that I wrote them down, but the first one is going to be literal.
Yeah, and literal. But again, when you're reading the Psalms,
Mhm.
and David says, "My enemies plowed furrows in my back,
Sure.
and they plowed them long and straight."
Yeah.
But you don't have an image of David getting
No.
knocked over in
Yeah.
a field,
Yeah. And then a little plow, like,
with ox,
yeah,
like an
okay.
ox-drawn plow.
yeah, God
Because
gathers
yeah.
his people like,
Under his
his
wing.
wing. Okay, well, God doesn't have feathers. We
Sure.
understand it's
Yeah.
it's a type of speech, it's a figure of speech. So we understand what similes and metaphors are, and there's nothing wrong with the Bible using them. So I literally believe when I'm, and this is what, and you know, you can call me a fundamentalist, and I don't take offense to that, even though I think I'm supposed to nowadays.
Oh,
You know, I think that's
okay, yeah.
usually mean in a derisive way. I am a fundamentalist when it comes to the Bible, and that is that I want to take the Bible literally as often as possible. And in that case, I literally believe that God considers himself to be a protective mother hen, just like a chicken that I have seen on my farm and how they would protect their young.
Right.
So, but I don't literally believe that God is some type of a bird with feathers.
Right,
Okay,
right,
it,
right.
it was the literal writing there was intended to be allegorical. Okay, when something is something else. Okay,
Yes.
so okay, so that's the literal interpretation. The other big one that we get is the allegorical interpretation. So another type of hermeneutics interprets the biblical narratives as having a level of reference beyond the people, the things, the events explicitly mentioned in the text.
Yeah, and I think when people go a little bit overboard there, it's to say, well, you don't even have to consider any of the events to be historically accurate.
And that's the danger.
Right, because the actual point is not the historical accuracy of anything that's gone on. It's the moral that it teaches.
Mhm.
Which and again, mine is some sort of a blend
Absolutely.
between the two.
It has to be.
I think it has to be.
Yeah.
So you look at like Noah's Ark, for instance.
Mhm.
Yeah, Noah built a boat.
Mhm.
Yeah, there was a flood. Yeah, there were 8 people on it. But that did all mean things too.
Mhm.
God rescues his people
Yeah.
from judgment.
Yep.
Obey what God tells you to do, and like maybe there's a reason why he's telling you to do certain things, even if you don't understand it. So both of those are at play,
Mhm.
but the tension between the two, I think, has caused a situation where it's like, well, if anybody starts drifting a little too far either direction, he's like, can I listen to this guy?
So we talked about the danger with literal, okay, which you know, I think that the danger with a literal interpretation, the examples are usually extreme and silly, which are insulting at best, which we mentioned the idea of David
Forgive
or
your
God
brother
being,
70 times, 7 times.
yeah. So,
So you've got
are
a
we
chart
keeping
somewhere,
track?
yeah. And when you get to 491, you
Yeah,
don't
then
have
you're
to do it
safe. Yeah.
anymore. Sure.
You know, so I think the examples are ridiculous, and I think it's obvious that a literal example would be ridiculous in a lot of cases. The allegorical interpretation, though, I think is obviously the more dangerous one because you can quickly use allegorical interpretations as the primary form of interpretation. So the danger comes when you dismiss a story as being a literal historical event. I don't see anything wrong with taking Joshua and using him as a type of Christ, which paints a picture of the Messiah to come. The danger comes when we dismiss Joshua as a historical figure at all.
Yeah, that never happened.
Yeah,
anyway.
and we assume he is just part of a story to help explain a point. So people who adopt allegorical interpretations of the Bible quickly dismiss difficult passages of the Bible, such as the creation account, the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. And it is also common for them to dismiss great portions of or all of the futuristic prophecies in the Bible. And we just say, and it's a neat, easy way to skip over stuff and not have to deal with it. And that's not what we do here on Bible Thumper. We make a stand.
Yeah,
okay.
Somebody's got to say it.
Yeah, so that's what we do here. So I think that's the danger when you start going down the allegorical road. Okay, so
I like that you call it allegorical, though. I'm gonna jump in just real quick
yeah.
because I think to say that it's spiritualized,
Mhm.
I don't think that quite hits the mark either.
Mhm.
Because like I'm of the understanding that God is pretty spiritual.
Yeah.
Like maybe heaven
Mhm.
is sort of spiritual.
Mhm.
That there are enormous pieces of what we believe that can only be categorized as
As
spiritual.
spiritual and
So
supernatural.
right, so just to sort of vilify that
Mhm.
also as like, well, you're a fundamentalist, well, you're a spiritualist.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, I think I see a way where those two things can come together
Yeah.
and maybe give you something really accurate.
So can I just now at some point, if you want to go over and define the terms exegesis and eisegesis as far as
Ooh,
to explain,
look at you go.
yeah, to explain, and these terms, just like hermeneutics, just think of your hermeneutic as your interpretation style or the method of interpretation. That's what that you use. That's what hermeneutic is.
Sure, sure.
So we can go over these terms as well, and you know what? Let's just do that now. And then, yeah,
if you got definitions written
yeah.
down, you go for it.
Sorry, everyone. I'm getting over a little bit of a head cold, and I still just got a dry like tickle in my throat. I wasn't coughing all day, but now that we hit record,
Well, as soon as you start talking all day,
Mhm.
and yeah, then it's over.
Okay, so two terms that you're going to run into sooner or later when you're talking about hermeneutics is exegesis and eisegesis. So exegesis is when you are reading the Bible and you are trying to learn what it means by reading what is actually there. So you are trying to get out of the Bible what it says. Eisegesis is when you are reading the Bible and trying to learn what it means by adding your own views into what it says. So if you go with the prefix ex, ex, it means out of.
Mhm.
The prefix eis, eis, means into. So the danger, and you just need to know this so you can spot it when someone's doing it, when a Bible teacher is putting their slant on something and they're trying to kind of bend the Bible to align with their personal beliefs. So they're putting their spin on it. And the fact is, the Bible just doesn't say that. Maybe it sounds good, but there's a danger to use the Bible to try to get evidence for a doctrine that it doesn't support. And the Bible's been used to do that. I mean,
Satan did it.
yeah, the devil did it. The Ku Klux Klan did it. I mean, there's groups all over the world that will continually try to use the teachings of Christ and the Bible to support, you know, crazy and wackadoo ideas that it just doesn't say. And that's eisegesis when they are putting their views into what the Bible says. So you want to try to get out of the Bible what the author meant, okay, not what we would like it to say. All right, so with that, my personal hermeneutical style.
Yeah.
Here we go. Number one, and this is what I think is the most important one to start with, and that is literal. And Zach, I call literal non-interpretive.
Non-interpretive. Okay.
So I was talking to one pastor and we were chit-chatting about something, and he was adamant that everybody interprets the Bible. And I was like, nope. And he's like, yeah, you know, no matter who it is, they always, you know, they're always giving their interpretation. I was like, a literal interpretation is called reading.
Okay.
Okay. That's not an interpretation. When God said, "Thou shalt not steal," well, what did God mean there? Thou shalt not steal.
Sure.
Okay, that's it. So I don't see that as an interpretation, because interpreting something is when you are trying to figure out what they are saying so that you can explain it to someone else. Have you ever used an interpreter?
Oh, yes, I have.
Okay, so what are they doing? They're listening to what you say, and then they're explaining it to somebody that doesn't understand it. But when I read it and you read it and we all understand it the same, it's not an interpretation. So what I like to tell people to do is take what I call, and I did not coin this phrase, okay, I stole it from someone, what I call the desert island challenge. You are on a desert island with nothing but a Bible, no interference from anywhere or anyone. What would you believe? Well, you would believe a very literal interpretation of the Bible. You would believe that God created everything in 6 days. You'd believe there's a worldwide flood in the days of Noah. You would believe a lot of these things, and you're not interpreting it. You're just reading the book and believing it. We do this with textbooks. We do this with, fiction and nonfiction and biographies. We do this all the time. We read a book and we believe what it says. That's it. It's not an interpretation. So literal is taking words at face value without metaphor or allegory. So the examples that we've already brought up, and I'm going to bring them up again right now just to make sure people understand, is that creation actually happened in 6 literal days like we now experience. It was a supernatural origin story of God creating everything. That is literal. We're not putting a spin on it. That's what it says.
He said, let there be light.
There's light. Okay. The flood in the days of Noah was a worldwide global catastrophe where all but 8 people drowned. The 8 survivors were on a boat for a period of about 1 calendar year that they made under the direction of God. God brought them 2 of every land-dwelling, air-breathing animal, some of other animals, to live on the boat with them during the flood. That's what it says. I'm not spinning it. So the literal interpretation, I always tell people this. Take a 9-year-old, give them the Bible. Take 59-year-olds, have them read the creation account and ask them all what happened. Well, God made everything. How long did it take them? 6 to 7 days, depending on how you look at it. If we count the day off, then it's 7 days. Sure. And I think that's the safest way to read the Bible is like a pack of 9-year-olds, because they're just going to read it and they're going to believe what it says. And that's always the safest and best place to start from, is the literal interpretation. So I believe those 2 stories, the creation account and the flood in the days of Noah, to be literal. I also believe Jesus walked on water, he raised the dead, and his mama gave birth to him while she was a virgin. That's just taking it for face value.
Died on the cross, rose from the grave.
You got it. You got it. Okay, 3 days later. So I believe all of that without metaphor or allegory. Tell me your thoughts on my explanation of literal interpretation to start with.
No.
And do you believe that's a good starting point?
I know you've got other things on here to talk about. So
we're going to add a lot more.
Yeah, we're going to add a bunch of stuff.
I'm just saying, you don't want to start with some other type of interpretation.
Right, because when you start with, okay, I'm going to read this and figure out what he meant to say by saying this instead of what he was going to say.
What did God want me to get out of the story? That's a fine question after you've done the literal interpretation.
So at some point we'll have to talk about the difficulty of people writing the books thousands of years ago in a different language from a different time frame. Like I got people I deal with in Kenya right now, and they can speak English. And we live in different worlds. So I do think that one's interesting.
And that might be, if we don't have time tonight, that'll be a great follow-up topic, because a lot of people have questions on it. And lo and behold, I have strong opinions on it.
Imagine.
Okay, so no problem with literal interpretation. You have no problem telling people a good place to start is just believe what it says.
Like when Paul was writing his letters, and he says, hey guys, about the question that you asked. Here's what I think you should do. Just like the way that you and I would write an email. I think that's a safe place to start.
There was a guy named Paul. There was a church in Corinth. He was writing to them.
He wrote a letter to those guys who he knew, and they had asked him questions.
And he was answering it.
Sure.
Okay, so moving on to some of the maybe more difficult or possibly, other ways we can look at Bible interpretation. Number two is I suggest that people use a historical contextual hermeneutic. Okay. So this manner of hermeneutical study asks or uses two questions. Question number one, what would this have meant to the author who wrote it? Question number two, what would this have meant to the original reader it was meant for?
Yeah. And that takes a whole school of study in itself.
Yeah,
to
you
try
need to
put you in
know
those mind
who
frames.
the author is, what was going on at the time.
Who's he writing to?
You got it. What were they going through? And this is why I'm a big fan of expository teaching. If you come to our church, we're going to get a book and we're going to go through it from start to finish.
Mhm.
Now we'll also go over topical stuff, but for the most part, we focus on expositional, expositorial teaching. You're going to get the history. You're going to get not outside of the Bible what was going on in the world. You're going to get what happened leading up to this point.
Mhm.
You're going to get who the guy was, where did he live, all this stuff. And the reason is, without knowing that, you're not going to have a good context, because life in 2022 in Western Colorado, what they're going through might not make sense. I've taught on the founding of America, and I've explained to people the First Amendment, when it applies to the government never running a church and the church never running the government, that those two things are not supposed to happen. Okay, the government is supposed to leave churches alone. The church is never supposed to run the government. You and I have no earthly idea why that would need to be in there unless you look at what was going on at the time.
Sure.
Less than 150 years ago, Galileo was on trial for his life because he dared to challenge one of the state church's teachings. And if you dared to do that, well, off with his head.
Right, exactly.
And you had kings and queens doing that all the time. Now, we don't deal with that now. So unless you get a little bit of context as to what was going on in 1776 and, 1791 and, the Constitutional Convention and the amendments and the Bill of Rights and the whole package, if you don't have any context, some of it might not make sense.
Sure.
Okay, so that's why I want to go over the author, what it meant to him, and the reader that it was meant for. So Jonah was a message from God to the Assyrians.
So if you don't know anything about Assyria, if you don't know who the god of Nineveh was,
all of a sudden,
it's like, wow, he got swallowed by a fish.
Yeah,
like,
you're gonna.
that's great.
Yeah, but there's a relationship between the fish and the fish god of
Yes.
Nineveh, the capital of the ruling power of the world, Assyria.
And if you don't know what Assyria had done
Yep.
to Israel,
Yeah.
then
A lot of it doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Amos was to the Jews in the northern kingdom prior to the Babylonian captivity. Well, that was different than the southern kingdom. You have Ezekiel being a message from God to the Jews living in Babylonia, and a message to the Jews who were still living in Jerusalem at the time, who were two groups. Malachi was to the Jews after the exile from to Babylon, when they came back to the land. So if you don't have any context, all of these books are going to be difficult, because you don't know if the Jews were doing well, if they were far from God, if they were obedient, if they were in the land, out of the land. Okay.
When you read Psalm 137, he says, "Blessed be he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock."
Uh-huh.
Like, unless you understand that these are people who had just been exiled
Yeah.
from their city,
Mhm.
the city had been laid siege.
Mhm.
they were eating their own kids.
Mhm.
Then their cousins,
Mhm.
the Edomites, gave them over as they were fleeing from the Babylonians. The Babylonians want them to sing a song, and they're just being honest with God, saying, look, the temple is gone,
Mhm.
our city is gone, our people is gone, we lost the promised land. I'm not telling you that I'm going to go grab their kids and smash them.
Yeah.
But what I'm telling you is,
Yeah.
I would really like for somebody to show up and take care of this.
Yeah.
If you don't have the context of what was going on in Jerusalem and at the temple,
Mhm.
you look at that and you're like, well, let's just take it out.
Yeah.
We don't need to. Let's
Yeah.
let's just.
Oh, yeah.
Where's Psalm 137? I've never heard of that.
Yep.
And it's just gone. So the historical, contextual, that is my favorite part.
Yeah.
I love studying that stuff.
Okay, so Isaiah in chapter 11 talks about God bringing Israel back to the land a second time. What people don't understand is when Isaiah wrote that, Israel never left the land the first time.
They were still in it.
They were still in the land. They hadn't gone to Babylon and been brought back the first time. So what are you talking about? Bring us back a second time. Now, us looking back and knowing history, we see 70 AD happen. The Romans, sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, burned the city, and the Jews scattered around the world. And then in 1948, God brings the Israelites back a second time.
Yes.
So again, without some context, so with a little bit of context, you can all of a sudden see that's a futuristic prophecy.
Yeah, it starts to make some sense. And I think it's not, the culture's changed so fast now.
Yeah.
Even compared to what used to happen. I spend a lot of time with college students.
Mhm.
I spend a lot of time with high school type guys.
Yep.
I mean, I'm telling you, when I was like, I'll have an 18-year-old kid say, man, when I was your age, I did not own a cell phone.
Mhm.
There was no context for them understanding what I'm even talking about.
Yeah.
And so to build a framework for people,
Yeah.
and the farther back you go, the more and more important it is.
Oh, yeah.
I'm 100% with you on that one.
So to wrap it up for people, I need to start from the point of understanding who wrote it, who they wrote it to, and what they intended the meaning to be. So when Paul writes to the Gentiles and explains things, he does it very differently than when he writes to the Jews. Well, why? Because they're two different groups of people that believe different things. They have different origins. So Paul addresses them differently. And if you don't know that and you have no context, then you're going to mix up doctrine and you're going to be like, why does it sound like he's contradicting what he said in the last book I read?
If you go from Galatians to James, you're like,
how does this work?
This doesn't even make any sense. Yep. But so you got to know what all of that is.
Jesus was the same way. And we're going to get to this in, I think it's my fourth or fifth. It's my fifth point as far as hermeneutics. Okay. So we're going to get there, and I'm curious to see what you think.
Ooh,
anything you want to add to the historical contextual?
I think the only thing I would add is I would say this. I think in order to do that really, really well, it takes a lot of study.
It does.
And it takes a lot of extra biblical study.
Yeah.
So I'm so careful about, I'll get history from all sorts of places.
Yeah.
But as far as like, okay, somebody tell me, what do we know about Isaiah?
Yeah.
Like I'm a little bit more picky about
the sources that you accept.
Right. But I think there's some really, really interesting extra biblical writings that Jewish people wrote that are absolute. There's
fill in some blanks.
There's stuff in the Bible mentions.
I think it does. It mentions other books. Like, haven't you read the book of Jasher? Why does this not make sense to you?
You can pull those down on Apple Books and read them.
So there were clearly other historical books that gave context to the Bible that were used by people at the time, and that was an acceptable practice.
This morning, you ever seen Dumb and Dumber?
Sure, the first one. And I never saw the sequel.
It's not worth it. The
That's what I
first one
heard.
was hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Lloyd Christmas, he's got a great line there. He goes, "We've dug ourselves into a hole, and now we're just going to have to dig ourselves back out." But I used that in a sermon this morning.
Yeah.
And so there's part of it's like, that doesn't mean I automatically believe that Dumb and Dumber was a real thing.
Sure.
But I'm using a cultural framework that the people that I was speaking to know, and taking a line from it to teach what I was teaching.
Yeah.
And I think the biblical writers did the same thing. And so the better we can understand what that culture was, and I would also say this, one of the hints that I get, especially with Jesus, you're reading Jesus and stuff, and it's like, okay, I made sense of all this. And then there's one line drop in there, and you just go, I have not, that doesn't make any sense at all. I think to myself, he is saying something to the people that he was talking to that he knows they would pick up on.
Yeah.
Like you said, the lend me a hand thing. Yep. There's something, he's using a form of speech that would clearly send a message to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
They're not confused. Yeah. And so I need to spend some time.
I need to do some homework to figure out what it is. Yeah. And that is a hint of something deeper that the Holy Spirit dropped in there for people that are willing to do a little bit of extra work. Okay. So that is the greater meaning or an additional lesson that you can get beyond the lesson of the literal face value, of what you're reading. Okay, so we read it literally. We understand the story that it's telling. We get the historical contextual framework. And then we can learn hermeneutical style number 3 that I use, typological and prophetic. Okay, so now we're getting into the mystical idea, which I have no problem with. And when I say typological, we could also use the term allegorical. Okay, so excuse me, when we're going over, sorry, I'm looking on my notes for something.
Yeah, I'm poking around you too.
Because I don't want to sound like an idiot any more than I have
to. Didn't you already do on your own just because?
Yeah. Okay, so to define a couple of words, metaphor and allegory. Metaphor means something is something else. Can you give me
say it one more time.
Something is something else.
Something is something else.
Yeah, boy, she's a walking dictionary.
Sure. I'm sure there's a better, proper English. But yeah.
Time is money.
The parables, or similar sort of. You can use something. They're a little bit different.
Yeah.
But you use.
You're talking an allegory.
That he dropped the ball like it was a hot potato. Like,
so the hot potato, the ball is a hot potato, is a metaphor. Okay, the parables are an allegory. So there's a story, and then there's a story underneath the story.
Yes.
So we're taking a story that everyone can understand.
It would be perfectly believable if it had actually happened.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to have.
No, correct. It doesn't have to have literally happened. It could be fictitious. But it is a story that paints a picture, that makes a point, that's clear to everyone. Jesus did this a lot with fruit and produce and growing trees and weather and things like this. Okay.
Sheep.
Yeah. Okay. Shepherding, which obviously the Israelites knew a lot about. So he told a story, but there was a story under that we were supposed to learn something from. So one of my favorite ones was the one where there was a husbandman who, you know, or no, there were, let's call it an owner of a piece of land who prepped the ground and irrigated and planted and grew a vineyard and left and lent it out to a bunch of husbandmen, I think is the term. So
Right.
God in the creation, okay? And then he leaves it to the people. Okay, so then it's time to get the fruit from this vineyard. And the owner sends some servants and they tell him no and they rough him up a little and send him home. Then he sends some more and they do the same thing and they kill some.
Yeah.
And then finally he says, well, I know, I'm just going to send my son and they're surely going to believe him. And they don't, and they kill the son.
Yes.
And we're reading about this, and then we kind of learn that, oh yeah, this is God talking to his people that he put in charge of the Old Testament and the law of Moses and all these things. And then he sent a prophet, and they're like, right, whatever. We know what we're doing. We've been in this land taking care of this vineyard for so long, and then he sends more prophets.
God can't kick us out of it. It's not possible.
Yeah, exactly. And they, and they beat him up and they rough him up and they kill a few of them, and then he sends a son. So it's a very clear picture that there's a story underneath that we can, relate it to. So we can take the point. Okay, so on to typological and prophetic. And if you want to say typological is allegorical, I don't think there's anything wrong, although types are a little bit different than allegories, because allegories are stories and a type is just one thing represents another. Okay, so
and almost always
represents
a true historical event that also represents something else to come. Yeah.
So God uses types in the Bible. Okay, if you don't understand that, you're missing a lot. So types of Christ in the Old Testament. Give me a type of Christ that comes to mind. Could be the New Testament. I don't care. Just give me a type.
I love that. This was a little bit obscure just because there's not a lot written about it. But I love the conversation Jesus has with Nicodemus. And so the serpent.
Oh, that's on my list.
Yeah.
Brazen serpent.
Obviously happened. Real event, real staff, real serpent made out of bronze, really nailed to the thing, really held up in the air.
For just to give context, it's in Numbers chapters 20, 21, 22, somewhere in there. So you can look it up, or if you have a concordance, just look up brazen serpent and you'll find it. Okay, so sorry, continue.
They've disobeyed yet again. Imagine God sends these
venomous snakes,
fiery serpents.
Seem to bite everybody.
They're biting people. They're dying.
Dropping dead.
And Moses is praying, and he goes like this, what do I do? Here's what you do. Make you a snake, nail it to a board, and hold it up in the air. And anyone who looks at it will be saved.
Yeah, the venom will not kill the people who look at this snake that you're just going to hold up in the midst of the camp.
Sure. And imagine Moses. He's like,
all right.
He's seen so much, right? Moses believes. He's like, okay, I guess that's what I'm going to do then.
Yeah.
So he does it. But Jesus, and Mr. kind of fun on this because he goes, you don't understand what the true significance of that is, other than like obey God.
Yeah, obedience. And, God will save you.
As strange as it looks, but Jesus says, just like the serpent that was held up in the wilderness,
so will the Son of Man.
So will the Son of Man, and He's the one nailed to the cross, and He takes the sin, and you have all this stuff. The serpent is like another level.
Oh yeah, so the serpent is representative of sin, from the garden. But it's made of brass, which means it will withstand the fire of God, fire representing judgment. So this thing that is held up, and understand, we learn about this later. So Zach is finishing the story by explaining John chapter 3, the story of Nicodemus, and this story culminates in verses 13, 14, and 15, leading up to the most famous passage in the Bible, John 3:16, where Jesus is explaining, I'm the serpent.
Yeah.
And what we learn, through the rest of the Gospels, Jesus, he wasn't a sinner. He became sin, just like that serpent, but he could withstand, the wrath of God and protect us from it.
And so it gives us both sides of the coin that I don't think we need to be having such a huge fight about all the time. That I have no problem with the actual events of the wilderness having happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Literally, that was a story that happens.
And I have no problem at all with Jesus saying, yeah, that literally happened, but there's so much more.
Yeah.
All of that is still true. The people who looked at that serpent on that board were still saved.
Yep.
But there's now when I do it, it's going to be even more for everybody.
So there is the story happened so that we could learn something else from it. It was just saved up for a couple thousand years until this time.
God never seems to be in much of a hurry.
Yeah. So the brazen serpent was the type of Christ. Okay. Let me do one. Noah's Ark.
Yep.
Okay. There was the wrath of God poured out on the sinners. God made a way to save, protect, preserve those that were obedient to him. Jesus was that ark. There was one door, okay, to get into. Once you were in it, the door was sealed by God, just like the Holy Spirit. Okay, seals it. Jesus calls himself the door in John chapter 10. And so anyway, the ark is a type of Christ that's representative of Jesus, and I believe that, as we said, there was literally an ark. 8 people on it. Everyone else in the world died. There was animals on it, the whole thing. But we see that it's also a type of Christ. It's a picture of something to come. It is a type. It is prophetic. Okay, so we can learn, things from it. And I use Noah's Ark as a prophetic picture of the end times as well.
Right. And we've talked about
that last time we got together, which I still haven't posted.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, I know. I'm hoping.
I wonder why nobody's calling.
Yeah. No compliments on what we did. Okay, so we can do that with different people as a type of Christ.
The whole, I don't know if it's literally every page.
Yeah.
But
there's so many main characters. Yeah. Everywhere. Joshua, Joseph, there's so many of that.
Passover.
Yeah. Animals, people, events. They all seem to have a current theme or thread running through them, which is Jesus. If you want to know what it's a type of, it's always a type of. Just put Jesus in the middle of it.
Right.
The tabernacle. Okay, points to Christ and is a type of Christ. Anyway, okay.
David is the king. And it's over and over.
So we can move. We can move on from this. The idea that after we read it literally, we get the historical contextual framework. We can try to get a deeper meaning. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with seeing if there's prophetic implications.
Right.
But we don't start with allegory as a must, because there doesn't have to be an allegory with everything. Okay. It could just be something at face value that God wants us to know.
Samson takes 300 foxes and ties them together with the torch in there. And you're like, okay, so what does this
300? How does that
fit
in?
This actually mean?
History of the world. When were there 300? Or what was a fox? What does the fox represent?
You can really go out into some interesting weeds.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and I would encourage everybody, don't be afraid to go there and try to figure it out. But you also have to remember what we say about exegesis and eisegesis. We don't want to force it. We don't want to bend the Bible to make it fit. Sometimes there are parts of the Bible that I'm just never going to understand.
Oh, man.
And that's okay. Do you know that was written down in the book of Daniel, where Daniel finished part of the book of Daniel? And he said,
terrified.
God, I don't know what this means.
Yeah.
What is this all about? And he literally says, Daniel, it's for someone else. Just put it on the shelf.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
But he's like,
all right.
Well, I'm kind of worried about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something else that God mentions in the book of Daniel, and I'm not going to be able to bring up the verse. I don't remember where it was. But he talks about how wisdom and knowledge concerning the Bible is going to increase over time, and more things are going to be revealed. And God gives us the idea that while little old me is reading my Bible by myself, I can actually be told by God an idea that has escaped theologians for centuries that nobody else saw. And it was because it was a special thing that God just had for me.
Yeah, yeah.
And don't be surprised if that happened.
Right. He also could not.
He could also not.
But if he does,
yeah, that's great that you got an insight from the Holy Spirit. And let me just give you a tip with that. The insight is not going to contain Kool-Aid. Okay? There is going to be zero Kool-Aid in the insight that God gives you.
I wish they didn't use Kool-Aid, man. Kool-Aid's so good.
It's really gotten beaten up, you know.
Sure. God, those guys, man.
Yeah. But how some guys are like, oh, God gave me this special revelation on this one verse, and we all have to move out into the wilderness over here and set up razor wire. And it's like, yeah, I'm thinking that might not have been God.
Maybe not.
Yeah, but maybe not. Okay, can I go? Let's see. Oh, yeah, so
name that one again.
That is typological,
and
prophetic. Now let me go over prophetic and explain this one. So I think this is the one that a lot of people are the most uncomfortable with, and it's because we are trying to figure out futuristic events.
Yeah. It could be tough to do.
Absolutely.
It's the one that we ought to be the most proud of, because I think it's the one that gives us the best. I think it's the strongest ground we have to stand on, that suggests that all of the Bible, start to back, all of the authors over all those years, what all of that information is given to us by someone who had capacity outside of what the authors were capable of having.
Yeah, a supernatural origin.
Absolutely.
Now, the book of Revelation, where my math is that 85+% of the book is talking about futuristic events that have not happened yet.
From here.
From today. That book is the only book in the entire Bible where God says, you're going to get a special blessing from me by studying it.
Read this book.
Yep. So God, because Caleb is one that always frustrates me, because his answer to futuristic prophecy is, well, I'll figure it out when it happens. And it's like, that's not what God says. I understand that. That's true for everybody. That was a default position before we started this conversation. God says to study prophecy. God put it in there for us. And not only did he put it in there for us, Paul says that we are to use it to comfort one another. It's supposed to be a source of comfort. So,
which is amazing to think about, because it is not.
Yeah, not always, not for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So we are commanded to study it. We are commanded to try to figure it out. If God wanted to write it as explicitly and as clearly as thou shalt not steal, he could have, but he didn't.
Sure.
He didn't on purpose, but that doesn't change the fact that he has given us the command and he wants us to do it. And I tell people all the time, don't be afraid to get into prophecy and study it. Over the course of a 12-year period of studying the Bible, you're probably going to change a few of your views. You're going to learn more. Okay, but it's a great, exciting way to get into the Bible, and there's nothing wrong with getting into prophecy and getting that special blessing from God by studying the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation is going to bring you to so many different books in the Bible that it quotes. It's going to bring you back to all these other books where you are going to really start to get a good understanding of the whole Bible.
And I'm not sure if we said that earlier on, but I do, somewhere in the hermeneutic, I do think it's I don't know if this is like maybe one of your main points, somewhere in there, the idea that I do think that the Bible is the best interpreter of itself.
I think that's a great point to make. So explain what you mean.
Well, if we go back to the typological ideas, Jesus saying that I am like the serpent
Yeah.
that was in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Then you go back and you read about the serpent
And learn about it.
And you go, okay,
Yeah.
if he is the one that's putting these two things together,
Mhm.
then there's something here for me to learn,
Yep.
to gain. And then you start thinking about salvation, calling on the name of the
Mhm.
Lord, and lifting up your eyes.
Mhm.
You start thinking about the cross and the death
Yeah.
and defeating the serpents
Mhm.
and all. So if you don't ever read the Old Testament and all you have is Jesus and Nicodemus,
Mhm.
well, there's a reason why people don't know that Jesus told that to Nicodemus.
Yeah.
Right? Because you grab onto John 3:16 because you can see it on a sign at a basketball game.
Yeah.
And you miss, like, he's building an argument that does sort of culminate there.
Yeah.
But when you don't understand what the argument is that
Yeah.
he's making,
Yep.
you miss an awful lot of it. And Revelation being at the end,
Mhm.
being complete, like the entire table is set
Yeah.
by all of the rest of Scripture. So if you study it without without using the table that's been set,
Mhm.
it's like just grabbing a chunk of cold meat out of the fridge and chewing on it.
Yeah.
Instead of doing the whole meal.
I've had people that argue with me about points on the 1,000-year millennial reign. And I've had some people that flat out tell me that it doesn't exist. And other people argue with me that the Bible is talking about the 1,000-year millennial reign in portions of Isaiah. Isaiah contains, I believe, the most written about the 1,000-year millennial reign. And I always tell people the reason that I believe this portion of scripture is talking about this timeline here is because it says it is. When you go here, there are linking parts where it gives you a key and says, this is the last trumpet of God. And it's like, okay. And then you read another part that talks about the last trumpet of God, and you're like, well, are these talking about? Yes, they're talking about the same part.
Because John didn't just see a vision and he's like, okay, I'm going to just write down exactly what I see. And yes, he did see a vision. And yes, he wrote down exactly what he saw. But the way that he wrote it down is completely saturated with the
quotes from the Old Testament that point you to certain portions that tie them together.
Because he's saying, well, this
is on purpose.
This is what I'm understanding. This
he's connecting dots,
and it takes work, man. It takes work.
Okay, so let's get on to, because we're almost at an hour, so I want to get through this. And I don't want this to be 2.5 hours because I got to be up real early.
Okay, I was looking at it earlier on, and I thought we're going to be on pace again.
We'll see. I mean, I think we could, but there's nothing wrong with tying a bow on it.
No, there is not. No, there is not.
So hermeneutical point number 4 is avoid anecdotal interpretations.
Avoid anecdotal interpretations.
Okay, so an anecdote is not necessarily true or reliable because they are based on personal experience and feelings rather than facts or research.
So this is kind of like,
so to give you an idea,
kind of situation.
Well, when you're trying to figure out what the Bible means, you cannot go, and this is a perfect example of eisegesis. My personal feelings and my personal experience, I'm going to project on the Bible, and therefore I'm going to come up with a conclusion. And Zach, I can tell you this, all of the stupidest things that have ever come out of a Christian's mouth in front of you have been anecdotal and emotional arguments for making a point. I actually had someone explain to me, well, I don't really think that there's anything wrong with homosexuality. My dog's gay, and I have a male dog, and he seems to only go after and try to hump other male dogs. So he's gay, and therefore God made him that way. So, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. I had a Christian say that to me with a straight face. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I won't speak to them anymore. I can't handle that level of stupidity. But my point is, I had someone tell me that make an argument against homosexuality because of a child that was in the daycare that they worked at. And they were explaining to me that this 4-year-old little boy always wants to, play with the dolls. And therefore, homosexuality is totally legitimate because
maybe missing some steps there.
yeah, they're connecting they're going from A to Z. They're skipping B, C, D, E, but what it is they want to believe that there's not a problem with it. And basically what it comes down to is they're getting pressure from somewhere in their life to not be against sodomy. And therefore they're using a Hail Mary, what can I use to justify my position of being completely 100% anti-Bible on this subject? So we don't use facts, logic, reason, and Bible verses. We use our own experience and we use feelings.
And I think it gets even more dangerous when we do use Bible verses, because I think there's a lot of that too. Love your neighbor.
Yeah.
Jesus says it.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters.
Well, because you don't use the Bible to determine what love is.
Yep.
You use your
own version, your own belief.
Like, love for me is nobody's rocking the boat.
Yeah. Everyone's happy. There's no confrontation.
And so if Patrick's rocking the boat,
then he's not being loved. Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
So all that is super dangerous.
So and that's a simple one. It's just you have to be aware that people are doing that. They're using their own personal experiences and their feelings, and they're putting that on the Bible rather than taking what the Bible says. Okay, number 5. Bless you.
Man, we're
dying in here. Yeah. Okay, number 5. My method, my hermeneutical system here, is avoid outliers.
Ooh, avoid. This is the one you were wondering about, right?
What's that?
The wondering what I thought about it?
Well, I think this has to be a rule because all the places where people get into a big mess, I think they die on the hill of an outlier. Okay, so you have this chart and you have all these points on the chart showing the consistent growth on the XY axis going in this direction. Then you have one out here. You're like, man, what the heck? What should we make of this in our statistics, study? It's like nothing. It's an outlier. It all points in the same direction except for that one. And there are far too many people that take that one verse. And whenever I run into somebody that thinks that baptism is a requisite for salvation,
I was just pulling it up.
Okay,
First Peter.
You got it. So, or Mark 16. Okay, they come and they grab, this verse or that verse, even though there's a mountain of verses that talk about grace and faith and not works, and how it's opposite. And, Ephesians hammers that home. And Romans, you got it.
Yeah.
Okay. In that picture in Numbers about the brazen serpent, one of the things that I always try to tell people is Moses was teaching us just how simple salvation is. He's like, it's so simple. You can't even believe it's that simple.
Yeah.
It's so simple that there were people that refused to believe that just looking at the brazen serpent would save them from the venom.
Of course.
And they refused to do it. They had pride and they wouldn't do it and they died.
Yes. Yes, they did.
All they had to do was look at it. Because when you look at it, you're acknowledging, that is the way of salvation. And that's the amount of belief you need.
Yes.
Okay. And even with the mountain of scripture that shows us that, how many people in the world get messed up on salvation because of an outlier here or there? Well, works has to be involved because, James 1, has a verse about it, and baptism has to be part of it because Mark 16, has a verse about it. And so I tell everyone, I was like, look, when there's 50 verses pointing you in one direction very clearly, and there's an outlier, you have to start out with the idea that you're probably missing something.
Yes, yes. So that's my pushback on this one would just be, and this might just be a I I don't know, like a personality difference, but
Mhm.
just it, I I can't say that I love the outliers
Mhm.
because I would be perfectly happy for all of the verses to be always
Yeah,
pointing in one
and
direction.
succinct.
I would have no problem with that at all. But I like the last sentence you dropped in there where um like when I'm reading Jesus and he says something and I go,
How
what
does
in the world
yeah,
do the vultures circling have
yeah.
to do with
How
anything
does
that
that
you've
fit
been
in?
saying? It gives me a place where I know
Mhm.
I'm missing something.
Yeah,
And sometimes it takes years and years.
sure.
And those are most of the ones that
Mhm.
I just don't figure out.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a harmonizing of things and all of that, but there's something about those outliers where I go, this is an indication that there is something about God and what He's teaching us that I don't know yet.
Yeah.
At the very least, it's just humbling,
Mhm.
like keeps you in your place.
Yeah.
But yeah, I look at those and I just they puzzle me,
Yeah.
and I do like. I wouldn't say avoid them, but I would.
No.
No, no,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
but I would say, um, as a hermeneutical principle, I think I look at those, and I don't. If you have 50 on one side and one on the other,
Yeah.
the one doesn't carry the weight.
Yeah, I'm not gonna build a doctrine on the one. I'm not gonna die on that hill.
Right. But I do look at it and I go, what is it?
Yeah.
That this side of it is so clear.
Yeah. What's God teaching me here?
What is the deal here?
Mhm.
That's and so then that goes back to the historical context.
Mhm.
Is there a clue here about who this author is
Mhm.
and
Who he's writing to. Yeah, that's a
Is,
big one.
yeah, is there something there that makes things a little bit different? Uh, Did Peter think differently about Paul on
Mhm.
certain things? And those are the questions that you get to sit down at coffee with
Yeah.
and struggle with forever.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing I would say is not to become so discouraged by the outliers
Mhm.
that you end up not able to stand anywhere.
Yeah.
Because then uh, you look at a list like from an atheist website or places that God contradicts himself.
Sure.
Or-
And that's what they do is they bring up the outliers and they're like,
And-
there you go. God doesn't know what he's talking about.
And there's a bunch of those you can
Sure.
explain away if you just take
Yeah.
3 minutes to read some context.
Mhm.
But I do think there are truths that the scriptures hold that we have not got our heads collectively
Oh, yeah.
wrapped around yet.
Mhm.
And those are indications to me that there's something more
Sure.
that he's going to reveal.
Yeah.
And I like that a lot.
Okay, my last hermeneutical principle
Mhm.
is the Bible doesn't work without dispensationalism.
The Bible doesn't work without. Well, you just would, wouldn't you? But so you have pre-flood
Mhm.
dispensation,
Mhm.
right? You have um, the wilderness. You could draw those in a lot of different places, I guess.
Absolutely. So
But-
let's start by defining. Give the people the idea of when someone comes up to you and they're like, Zach, I just heard this idea of dispensations. What does that mean?
And usually it's wrapped up in eschatology, right? In the study of end times.
Mhm.
But the basic definition of the word is essentially just that God works differently in different times.
Mhm.
He is no different.
Yeah.
But before he made a covenant with Abraham, he hadn't made a covenant with Abraham yet.
Yeah. So
So things were a little bit different.
yeah, before Moses and the law, there was no Moses or law. Okay.
So he works differently.
Yeah. So
After Jesus,
Mhm.
a different dispensation
Yeah.
just simply means now, I mean, God can change the rules if he wants to.
Yeah.
And I think he lays out pretty clearly when he does and
Yes.
why he does and
Yes.
who he does it for and all of those things. But yeah, to say that uh, if the Bible doesn't work without dispensations means that things were different in the Garden of Eden than they are now.
Correct.
Then absolutely.
And that's the idea. So, dispensational theology, you could probably get several definitions from several people, but I think it's safe for us to say that God dealt with different people in different times in different ways. And it wasn't a contradiction of who God was, but and I say that not only are there dispensational time periods, but we can also look at God dealing with different groups in different ways and different institutions in different ways. So to give an example that everyone can very easily look up, just to give everyone a starting point, is dietary restrictions in the Bible.
Sure.
Okay, so in the Garden of Eden, what was the diet that God gave to man?
Vegetarian.
They were vegetarian. That's what God said. Then post flood in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1, 2, and 3, what does
Just as
God
I
tell?
gave you the green herbs of the ground to eat, so now I also give you the animals.
Yeah, so you can now eat the animals. So, and which animals could they eat?
I don't think he specifies in chapter 9
Nope.
of Genesis.
He doesn't.
There's no specification.
So the assumption is you can eat them all. Now, we do know, and this is always a fun topic of discussion, is that when they were on the boat, we do find out that there were clean and unclean animals. So whether they knew that that was part of the diet or not, we're not told that. We do know that they knew which animals were going to be used to sacrifice to God.
Correct.
But we didn't know. Clearly, there were no clean and unclean animal restrictions like there were at the time of Moses, because Noah handles an unclean bird when he sends out the raven, okay, which you aren't allowed to touch unclean animals. So there's a different diet after the flood than there was before the flood. And there are reasons for it. And the reasons are not complicated or hard to figure out. And like you said, with just a little bit of work, even the timelines are drawn pretty clearly. So when they got off the boat, the whole earth was underwater for a whole year. Well, there wasn't a field with a harvest ready for them to pick and cook and make a salad out of. So they started with, we have to be able to eat some animals, and then we're going to start growing stuff. Okay, so anyway, then you have the Mosaic diet. What was that?
That's in Leviticus mostly, and there's a lot to it. There's plenty to it. But
the basics are
classically you're like no pork. There's
no birds that are fins and scales are the fish, and the birds cannot be scavengers or meat eaters. They got to be So you go through and you find out you can eat animals, but only certain ones. And then you can only certain ones. And you can eat all the fruits and veggies. So God again gives a diet to Moses, and then there is the New Covenant Book of Acts diet that some might argue about, but it seems like it goes back to there's nothing unclean. You can eat everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Paul even goes about saying that. At one point. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing unclean.
Yeah. So we see at least 4 different diets for different people at different times, and there was reasons for it. So anyway, that is what we're talking about when we're talking about dispensations. Now, with that, I also want to give the idea that God deals with different groups of people and institutions in different ways. And if you don't understand this, then you are not going to be able to read and understand parts of the Bible. You are going to get confused, and it comes down to the historical contextual part. Who are they talking to?
Yes.
Because there are 2, and we could really very easily say there are only 2 groups of people in the whole Bible. What are those 2 groups of people?
The Israelites and Gentiles.
You got Jews and Gentiles. That's it. Okay. And then you also have saved and lost, and that's it. So in a lot of different ways, you have these 2 groups of people, and they are talked about differently. You have the sheep and the goats, right, on one hand, and the left hand and the right. You have the Jews and the Gentiles. And when Paul writes a letter to the Hebrews, and when Paul writes a letter to the Romans, and when Paul writes a letter to the Galatians, or those in the churches of Galatia, it's funny, so many people talk about, the church of the Galatians, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, Galatia was a region, and there were many churches. And it's
Right.
easy if you don't
Sure.
know the history. I get okay, so I just didn't want
Yeah. No, I'm
to
with
give
you.
that
Yeah,
caveat.
I'm with you there.
So if you don't know who he's writing to, you might misunderstand, parts of what he's saying. And in the same way, if you don't understand that Jews and Gentiles are different, if you don't understand that the nation of Israel and the church are different, they have a different origin, a different mission, and a different destiny. And if you don't understand that, then when Jesus talks about the two groups, you get confused because you're lumping them all into just mankind. And it's like, no, the Jews are treated differently than the Gentiles. The church is not the nation of Israel. And those two groups are going to be doing different things at the same time, and they both have different jobs. And that's why eschatology, which is the study of the end of the world and in the Bible, the end times, when you're studying eschatology, people get confused because they don't have some hard lines drawn, so they don't know who the commands are going to and how it works. If you don't understand the dispensations, that there is a time period where up until the Messiah, and then after the Messiah leaves, there is what most people would call the church age.
Mhm.
And then there's a time coming that's going to be different when the church age is over. And the Bible talks again and again and again in several different books about this 1,000-year period of time. Okay. And things are going to be different, and Satan's going to be chained up somewhere in the pit. Okay. And all these things are going to happen. But if you don't understand that that is a time period where things are going to be different, then when you read through the book of Isaiah, you're like, where does this fit? What in the world is he talking about? So that's what I mean when I say the Bible doesn't work without dispensationalism. So you need some ground rules. And if you don't have the appropriate ground rules, some of the bigger ones are Jews and Gentiles are different. The nation of Israel and the church are different. If you don't have these ideas, then the teachings of Christ, the teachings of Paul, a lot of teachings you run through in the New Testament, you don't know where to go, where to put it. You get confused, and it can be very frustrating.
Oh yeah.
The first time I read the Bible, I didn't understand most of this.
Sure.
And
Sure.
And this is the best piece of advice I'll give everybody. When you read the Bible, don't worry about the parts of the Bible you don't understand.
If you're brand new to it,
Yep. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
You're going to read it more than once.
plenty of time.
Just worry about the parts you do understand. And then you're going to understand a little more the next time you come through. So, that's a good way to do it. When something's interesting, underline it or highlight it, write a question mark there, ask your pastor, get a little bit,
Plenty of time to come back.
Yep. You don't have to worry about it. You're not going to understand it all. Even when I go through a book now, I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit this. We're going through the book of Obadiah right now. Which, we're going through the chapter of Obadiah. It's 21 verses. It's a short book. And this is the first time I've studied it. And when I'm going through it and I'm writing up my notes, there will be a verse here or there where I'm like, I really hope I don't get a question. Because it's like, I really don't know the answer to this. Like, I know the answer to a lot more than I did before I ever started studying the book, but I don't know the answer to everything.
I think if every Bible teacher was truly honest,
sure,
they would have no choice but to say that.
Absolutely. And with that being said, when you're studying the Bible, having these guidelines of hermeneutics, I think is going to help you. But don't be scared when you don't understand something. The best thing to do is get a notebook and jot down all your questions, and then grab your pastor or to a lesser degree, an assistant pastor or whatever they do.
40%.
Yeah.
40% of a real pastor.
But get whatever Bible teacher you're familiar with and sit down and ask some questions, and you'll get some answers, and then you pray about it and you wait for some answers. And there are going to be things that you're going to read in the Bible that you're not going to understand. And I've prayed about them, and it wasn't for years and years and years that all of a sudden God was like, for whatever reason, hey, guess what, Patrick? Today's the day you're going to understand this thing you've been wondering about.
And that's the beauty of it. Even though we do want to understand as much as possible, the goal is actually for God to be changing us, not for us to have a cognitive understanding of everything that it says.
Yeah.
And through that process of the prayer and the struggling with the questions and the finding new things, that's how he changes us.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like those things. I mean, what happens is people start drawing lines in different places.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all that goes on. But I'm pretty comfortable with all of those. See, everybody, Patrick isn't that crazy after all.
You just got to get me. See, this is more of a philosophical discussion,
sure,
rather than a doctrinal discussion.
Yes.
So if you get me on philosophical discussions, I'm just a sweetheart.
Oh yeah, because like there's going to be some people that could take those 6 things and they would read Genesis 1-2 and go, the author is obviously not trying to teach us anything about
historical.
Even if it is historical,
that's not the point. Who cares?
The point here has nothing to do with how many 24-hour periods are involved.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing here is something completely different, and they might even have a good point about things. I think that the creation story, especially, is a brilliant story of the first temple.
Yeah.
It is where God dwelt on the earth.
Yep.
And so I think that's a really cool sort of like deeper thing that's underneath there.
Yeah.
But so everybody can still use those same 6 guidelines and still come up with a little bit different ideas here and there.
And we could put something together there, because if you think about it, if that was the original temple, then the original intent was for God to be with us without any barriers whatsoever. And then when he made the next temple, which was the tabernacle in the wilderness, there was like 100,000 rules involved to be able to,
because Adam and Eve, they're not, being kicked out of the garden, I think is equivalent to you can't be in the temple anymore.
Correct.
You can't be in my presence.
Nope, you can't do it.
But now that my presence is supposed to be with you, because that's like most of the point.
Yeah.
But I got to create a way for that to happen.
Yeah.
So it needs to be clean. It needs to be right. It needs to be without sin.
And then when Jesus comes, then the temple opens up a little more, and the veil is rent in twain. And then we get the whole idea. So all of a sudden we're a little closer than we were, before.
Because he is God on earth.
You got it.
With us.
Yeah. So anyway, and there's nothing wrong with going over any of those ideas, and all of those make a good Sunday school lesson, and they make a good sermon when you don't know what else to talk about. So there's nothing wrong with going deeper. I just I don't think it's the best place to start. I think it's something else to use as a tool.
I do believe that there's a caution there in that if the first question is, well, okay, fine, but what does it really mean?
Yeah.
And I do think there could be a tendency there to move so far away from
where you miss
relevance.
the point, which is that queers are bad. And
here we go.
And it's a capital crime, and they need to be stoned outside of the city. Can we just start with that as the foundation?
There's dispensations, Patrick.
Okay, so with that, everybody, thank you for
still an hour and a half, even though we went quick.
No, we still had plenty to say, and I'm glad we tied it up.
Yep.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. You can join us. I don't want to say every Sunday night, because the last two weeks didn't work, but you can join us most Sunday nights, 7 p.m. Mountain Time, 8 p.m. Central, and you can find us if you go to Facebook or YouTube, search for the Bible Thumper Podcast, and you can find the podcast anywhere that you download and listen to a podcast, on Apple, Google, Spotify, yada, yada, yada. Please download them, like them, share them, leave a comment somewhere, and if you are a follower of mine on YouTube, we just want to encourage you, get back on your medication. You're going to help everybody. Okay, just go ahead and do it. I know you don't like it. I know you think the doctors, have inserted nanobots into your bloodstream and they're trying to take over, but the,
Wow.
the medication will help. So just go ahead and go
And,
back on it.
and Caleb's going to get to come back and defend himself, right?
No, Caleb doesn't listen to this. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so anyway, thanks for coming, Zach.
Yeah,
It's always
you
a
got it,
pleasure to have you, and
sure.
we'll do it again.
All right.